Alrighty, welcome in everyone to just another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, November 14th. We got a big time weekend coming up. We got a little bit of a shorter show today. We just got two things for you today. Wanted to get into all of the college football playoff chaos that is going to come. There's going to be some type of chaos that unfolds. We'll go through every conference and kind of break down the couple of chaos scenarios that do exist in each one. Probably didn't cover all of them. If I'm being totally honest, there's plenty of things that could happen over the next little bit, and then we'll just do our best bets going into this weekend, and then we'll call it a day. A little bit of a shorter show today. Wanted to make sure we got into all of these chaos scenarios because quite a bit of it should be figured out this upcoming weekend. Let's go ahead and jump into that, and let's start in the SEC. I think everyone's talked about this by this point, but the 10-2 nightmare is a very, very real thing. In the SEC, you would need three teams to win out the rest of the way. It would be Texas, Oklahoma, and Vanderbilt. Now, I think it's fair to say Texas probably has the toughest task of all those three teams. They go to Georgia this weekend, have Arkansas and then A&M at home. Two top five matchups. Be very unlikely that Texas ends 10-2, but if they win this weekend, everything is on the table for the Longhorns. For Oklahoma, at Bama, you win that one, then you get a Missouri team that's on their backup third string quarterback, really, and then LSU, a team that is kind of reeling as the season ends. Then for Vanderbilt, it's Kentucky next week after a bye this one, and then at Tennessee. Really, you just got to win that Tennessee game. Kentucky playing much better football, so that's a dangerous one, but overall, they really just got to beat Tennessee, and then they're probably right in that 10-2 realm. That leaves you with at least seven teams that have at least 10 wins, and then you would have an 11-1 Ole Miss, an 11-1 Texas A&M likely in this scenario, and then you would have to figure out where you go from there. I have no earthly idea. I do know it would be Texas versus Ole Miss in the championship game because they would have the one loss in conference. They would have the head-to-head over Georgia as well as A&M. They would end up going in the SEC championship. The question is, what would happen around that? Would Oklahoma be the team that doesn't get into the mix? Would Oklahoma and Vanderbilt miss out? Would Oklahoma's win over Alabama knock Alabama out? But then Alabama has the win over Georgia. It would get very, very messy, and Georgia could be a team that ends up getting left out, as crazy as that sounds, at 10-2 if you get to this scenario. But I would say it's fairly unlikely that this happens. I think 10-2 teams is very much on the table in any of those combinations. I think Vanderbilt and Oklahoma are probably your best options. You're probably going to have at least five, depending on where that comes from. Vanderbilt obviously would be the team that you probably bet on in that scenario to join Alabama, A&M, Ole Miss, and Georgia near the top of that conference. But it's going to get messy, and there's a world where you have 10-2 teams. I can promise 7 SEC teams are not getting in. I do think there's a world for 6, but as of right now, there's 5 in there. I can't imagine we're getting 2 more of those SEC teams. So someone's going to miss out at 10-2. In this scenario, it could very well be the Georgia Bulldogs. It could very well be Alabama, 2 teams that right now will be at the very top of the conference right there with A&M. And then there's the other part of that question. If all of those teams go 10-2, I think this question is relatively moot. But let's say Oklahoma loses this weekend. Let's say Vanderbilt loses at the end of the year to Tennessee. Could a 9-3 Texas get into the field? That's probably a very, very interesting question for a number of reasons, because even if, let's say, Vanderbilt wins out and they win the rest of their games, they're a 10-2 team compared to a 9-3 Texas, but Texas has that win over Vanderbilt. What does that conversation look like? Could that go back and forth, and maybe Texas gets the nod over a 10-2 Vanderbilt? That would create a lot of chaos, I can promise you that. But you have a 10-2 Notre Dame in that mix. Maybe you have a Miami that runs the table the rest of the way, a Utah right in there. Could a 9-3 Texas outweigh those teams? I think it'd be up for debate. I think it'd be very, very a big time question. Let's say they lose this weekend and then they find a way to beat A&M at the end of the year. I think there's a real conversation to be had there. Now, they wouldn't be in the SEC championship, so they wouldn't be able to add to that resume by any means. But I do think with enough chaos around them, which is something we'll talk about over the next little bit, I think just about everything in these next 3 conferences needs to fall in place for Texas to get that 9-3 bid. But I think if any team in the country is going to get into this thing at 9-3, it's probably the Texas Longhorns, because they have that shot for a top 5 win over the next 3 weeks to get to 9-3. So we'll see how that develops. I'd be a little bit surprised if a 9-3 Texas found their way in, but if all the rest of the stuff that we're about to talk about kind of plays itself out, then we have a real conversation to be had. Moving to the Big Ten. The Big Ten really is as straightforward as any of these conferences. As we get down the stretch, USC and Michigan are the two teams you're going to want to watch if you're a Big Ten fan and you want more than three teams from your conference to get into this thing, because USC could win out, go 10-2. They would beat Oregon in the process, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but that would be a team that absolutely would be at least in the CFP conversation. I tend to believe pretty firmly in the CFP. Michigan, if they run the table and beat a team they've become pretty accustomed to beating, then they can move forward into the CFP as a 10-2 team as well. Obviously, both those teams could lose those games, and they will not be favored in either of those, so these are relatively, I don't want to say far-fetched because I think they're firmly on the table, but these are not the likely outcomes. I think it's fair to say the likely outcome is three teams from the Big Ten: Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana, and then these two teams finish 9-3, and maybe with enough chaos things get a little bit interesting, but I have to imagine at 9-3 these two teams would be out of the mix. The other question about that, let's say USC goes 10-2 and Michigan doesn't. Let's say Michigan loses to Ohio State, but USC is able to run the table, beat Oregon, and see what they can do, or be at least in the CFP conversation. Where does that leave Oregon? Could a 10-2 Oregon miss out on the CFP is the big time question here. Obviously, it sounds crazy at face value, and I totally understand that. But let's go back to the SEC idea that we threw out there a second ago. A 10-2 Vanderbilt, a 10-2 Oklahoma, maybe more aggressively, a 10-2 Oklahoma. Is that a team that could have a little bit more of a quality win over an Alabama compared to Iowa being the best win for USC if they were to lose to being the best win for Oregon, if they were to lose to USC later in the season? I think there would be a real debate there. I think even with a 9-3 Texas, I think you have a real debate between them and a 10-2 Oregon. I find it hard to believe that a 10-2 Oregon would be left out of this field, but they're sitting right in kind of that bubble area, and one loss to a USC team or maybe even Washington at the end of the year, that could be enough to knock you out. We'll see how all of that unfolds. I think if there's any team from the Big Ten that would fall out at 10-2, it's probably the Oregon Ducks, because Iowa would be your best win, and there's a number of other teams right around that bubble area that would probably have more quality wins at that point. Is there a path to two teams for the Big 12 is a huge question. I came up with three different options about how this could happen, and I find a lot of them to be relatively far-fetched. But Cincinnati, if they win out and beat Texas Tech in the title game, I think Texas Tech has done enough to get in at 11-2. This is all obviously assuming that Texas Tech runs the table the rest of the way, gets to Arlington with no problem. So I think Texas Tech has done enough. That's obviously will be up for debate. They'll be right in the conversation with a possible 10-2 Oklahoma or a 10-2 Oregon or whoever at the end of this thing. That's where they would end up falling. I think they would win out in that conversation, especially what happened last year with SMU. I think BYU, if they were to win out and beat Cincinnati and then beat Texas Tech and avenge that loss, I think that's actually a much more likely case than the Cincinnati case of it, because I think then you have a team that obviously proved that they're two tough teams that can go back and forth. Any team can win on any day. And you have two teams that have shown the ability to beat high-quality teams like a Utah or a Cincinnati in terms of BYU. So I think that's a relatively, of all these cases, I think that's the one where you almost definitely get two teams in. And then you got the other option, which is Texas Tech dominates the rest of the way, and then you have an interesting conversation around Utah. Can Utah be an at-large team? Now, they're sitting at number 13 in the country right now when you come to the CFP rankings. That's a big time question. You know, where can they jump up to? Where could they possibly fall to in certain scenarios where teams behind them get massive wins? A lot of this is up for debate. Frankly, I think Utah might be a little bit overranked right now, but I still think they're a team that are firmly in the mix for this thing. The big time question that I have, and I think the committee will have by the end of the year, let's say Texas Tech dominates the title. They win by 20 points over, let's say Cincinnati in this case. They win over by at least 20 points over Cincinnati, and then you look up and you have to convince yourself that the second best team in a conference that was firmly dominated by one team is still a top 12 team in the country. I think that's going to be a relatively hard thing to do. Even if they assume that Texas Tech is a top 4 or top 5 team in the country, which I tend to believe they would if they go on the rest of the way they are right now, you'd still have to be able to make that argument. I think it'd be relatively tough to. I think if Texas Tech just dominates the rest of the way, I think that Utah team will just slowly start to slip behind teams that get big time wins down the stretch of the season, whether that's a Miami finds a way to run the table the rest of the way, or someone right behind them. Maybe Vanderbilt gets another big win over Tennessee. I think you'd start to see that Utah team just slip right out of the bubble. That's up for debate. It definitely is a very good Utah team, a Utah team that deserves a lot of respect. But I do think there's a world where Texas Tech dominating the rest of the way actually hurts Utah's chances to get into the CFP, even if it would knock out a Cincinnati and a BYU from that conversation. So that's something to watch as we move forward. Also, then you would have Utah right in the mix of an Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, BYU, Cincinnati, all of those teams being right there. It would be very, very interesting. They'd probably need all those teams to lose one more. I'd be surprised if Utah ended up being an at-large team. I'd be much less surprised if Miami ended up being an at-large team compared to Utah, and that's what we'll talk about right here. The path to 2 teams for the ACC is very narrow. It's very unlikely that they're going to be able to find 2 teams into this mix unless things get a little bit weird, and they don't want to get super weird. We'll talk about that scenario here in a second, but it really rides on Georgia Tech, in my mind at the very least. For the ACC to get 2 teams, I think pretty much one thing has to happen, maybe 2 things, and we'll talk about that when we get to Duke. But if Georgia Tech were to win out, including a win over Georgia, and they were able to, they could lose the ACC championship and still make the field. It would kind of depend on who they played. Now, if they played a Duke team and they lost, then you might have a problem. Then you might have a conversation where they just lost to an 8-4 team. Maybe they fall further, and then Duke doesn't get in. And we'll talk about that here in a second. And then the other chance is the Miami at-large bid. That's the other chance for you to get 2 teams into this thing. You have a normal winner like Georgia Tech or Virginia or whoever, and then Miami's able to win out the rest of the way and kind of back in with a couple losses in front of them. That's very much on the table. There's no doubt about that. Miami at 10-2, I think would beat out a Texas 9-3 team. I think that's the one where with that win over Notre Dame, they would have a win over Pitt if they were able to win out the rest of the way. I think that would be enough to edge out that 9-3 Texas compared to some of the other teams that I think would have a tougher job in terms of resume to do that. So that is absolutely a possibility. Miami could win out the rest of the way, be a 10-2 team, and probably be sitting in that 10-11 spot, depending on where the group of 5 and the ACC champion end up coming from. But overall, those are the 2 ideas that I have right now. Is you have a very straightforward finish to the season. Let's say Virginia and Georgia Tech win out. Georgia Tech gets a big win over Georgia, loses by, let's say, 3 in the ACC championship. Then I think you get 2 teams. Or you have that same scenario. Maybe Georgia Tech ends up winning that game. Maybe they lose to Georgia, but they end up beating Virginia in the ACC championship. And then Miami is able to back in as an at-large bid. The problem is there is a narrow path to get 2 teams. You're very likely to get 1 team unless Duke comes in and messes the entire thing up. That is very much on the table. This Duke team is currently 2nd in odds to win the ACC. That's because it's not that bad of a Duke team. As crazy as this sounds, a 5-4 team, they can play with just about anyone in this conference. They've proven that they can play with anyone in this conference. The problem is they get blown out by Illinois. They get rolled by Tulane when they go down there, and then they lose a game to UConn last week. So you could be looking at a situation where they walk into that game 8-4, they leave 9-4. That doesn't guarantee them a spot in the CFP. That is the one thing that I think people are starting to figure out, but maybe didn't know the first year. The 4 Power 4 champions are not guaranteed spots in this thing. It is the top 5 conference champions, period. It doesn't matter what conference that's from. So there's a world here where South Florida is able to win the American, or even Navy is able to do the same thing. They're ranked above them. And then JMU, a team from the Sun Belt that a lot of people are not talking about quite enough right now. If they get up into the rankings, let's say next week, they get up into the rankings and Duke is able to beat Virginia but is ranked right below them, then we have a real conversation to be had about JMU and USF getting in and the ACC maybe being left out altogether. Or maybe a Miami team being in as an at-large from the ACC, but the champion not even being in. All of this is on the table, and it's really just up to the Blue Devils. Do they want to be the team that totally changes the complexion of the CFP, not only this year, but moving forward? Because if Duke is able to do this, there's going to be a lot of people in the ACC that are arguing that that should be enough to get us into the CFP, and then there's going to be a lot of people over in the SEC and the Big Ten and the Big 12 saying they shouldn't get any guarantees. We should be getting more guarantees than they do. They've proven that they're not a top-tier conference anymore. All of this is on the table, and it comes down to Manny Diaz in the squad. We'll see what they do against Virginia this week. I picked them to win because I tend to believe that's just how the season has gone. I think we're going to get a little bit more chaos in this thing. I think they're going to find a way to get to Charlotte. We'll see what happens from there. It's going to be a messy finish, but Duke is one of those teams that could totally knock the ACC entirely out of it. There's a world where a Duke team makes it as a number 20 ranked team in the country. It's a little crazy. I understand it would totally change the conversations going to be had over this format moving forward, but it's very much on the table as we head into the back end of the season. And then you always have this. The Notre Dame factor is always a piece in this. If they win out, they are going to be in. I feel very confident about that. Now, is there a world where a 10-2 team is left out for another 10-2 SEC team? I suppose, but the placement of Notre Dame right now, I think they're in really, really great shape. So I think they're more than fine at 10-2. They get in. If they lose, they're out. I really don't think there's much debate there. I don't think anyone's kind of going back and forth on that. Obviously, the USC win is a massive one. Obviously, that is one that you can hang your hat on a little bit. But at the end of the day, that's not going to be enough to beat out some of the big-time 10-2 SEC teams that we talked about, or a 9-3 Texas, or an at-large Miami or Utah. There's too many teams in that mix for Notre Dame to make it. If they lose, if they win, they will be firmly in that mix, and that will take one team away from whoever else. If they lose, then that opens the door for a sixth SEC team, possibly a fourth Big Ten team that maybe is a 10-2 Oregon after they struggled down the stretch. ACC could get a second team like an at-large Miami, or get one team as an at-large Miami. We could get two Group of 5 teams, which I guess wouldn't change with Notre Dame, but the Big 12 could get two teams. All of that is very firmly on the table for this. Notre Dame is always going to be a factor in this. I get that upsets a lot of people. They're always going to be a factor. If they go 10-2 or if they win out the rest of the way, they will be in the CFP, and they're not a team that I want to play. I promise you that. But in terms of what I think is going to happen, the breakdown that I see happening in the CFP, I think the SEC is going to get 5 teams. I think there's too many teams right at the top that are going to be able to win enough games down the stretch. Even if Texas, Oklahoma lose, even if Vanderbilt loses at the end of the year, I think there's a world where a 9-3 Texas, if they were able to beat A&M at the end of the year, of course, is able to back their way into this thing. So I do think the SEC will get 5 teams, whether that's Vanderbilt, Oklahoma, or Texas, adding to the 4 obvious ones of A&M, Georgia, Alabama, and Ole Miss. We'll see. Now, if Texas and Oklahoma win this weekend, then you never know who those 5 teams are going to be. It could very well not include Alabama or Georgia. For the Big Ten, I think it's going to be 3 teams. I just don't fully buy into what USC has. I have them losing this weekend to Iowa. So I do think the Big Ten is going to be stuck with 3 teams. I'm going to lean towards Michigan losing to Ohio State right now. We'll see how that pick develops as the next couple of weeks go on. I think the ACC is a one-bid league. I don't think Duke is going to throw the wrench that they usually do, or they could throw into it. That's still very much on the table. There's no doubt about that. And even then, they could get 1 team in there. For the Big 12, I'm going to go with 1 team. I think Texas Tech rolls the rest of the way. I think Utah gets a little bit hurt by that, just gap that seems to be forming in the Big 12. And then I think you have your Group of 5 team, and I think Notre Dame makes it into the CFP. That's the way I see it right now. This weekend could change a lot. You could have way more SEC teams being in the mix, or a pretty good idea of who's going to be in the mix, out of the mix at the end of this weekend. Point is, it's going to get weird. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be things that we have to figure out. There's going to be a lot of arguments. There's no doubt about that. There's going to be a 9-3 Texas against a 10-2 Miami. There's going to be things. I can almost promise you that. We'll see if this weekend provides even more chaos or helps us start to figure out what this thing is, and we'll do this next week to make sure we're all up to date on where we stand and what this thing might look like at the end of it all. But let's take our first break, our only break of the day, and we'll get into my best bets for this upcoming weekend. We got some great ones in. feeling a little bit good about these ones. Hopefully a great week to get back over 500. We'll talk about it all right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into a lot of different stuff about the CFP. It's going to get chaotic. There's quite a few teams that could get in as at-large bids that you probably have written off. There's a 10-2 Oregon scenario where they miss out entirely. There's 10-2 Georgia scenarios where they miss out entirely. It's going to get very weird, and we'll figure out a lot this weekend. We will reconvene next week at some point to go over all of the stuff that we know, and hopefully it's a clearer picture. It could get a lot more messy as well, so we'll keep you updated as that unfolds, obviously, but we got best bets to get to for this upcoming weekend. Still below 500, but feel pretty good about this week. Feel good as we head into this one, and I think it's going to be a very, very fun week of football. And we're going to start with USF minus 9.5 over Navy. I love this USF team. I think they're playing so confidently right now, and the big thing that I think some people are missing about this team is their defense isn't absolutely gangbusters awesome. Obviously, North Texas had quite a nice game on them. Now, a lot of that was forced because USF was up in a hurry. This is a tough defense. It's a very physical defense. And I think when you talk about Navy's offense, obviously, they want to run the ball and then bait you into stuff. Now, this is an aggressive defense for USF, so maybe they can get a couple of big plays over the top if you're Navy, but I think they're going to do pretty well at slowing down this run game. I think Eli Heidenreich is going to make a play in this game, but USF's going to be able to do enough to slow him down as best as just about anyone can, because that's a tough guy to slow down, but it's basically a playing game for the American Championship. I think USF really wants that thing. I think last year left a little bit of a bitter taste in their mouth, and they're ready to go get after it. I just love the physicality of this team, and I don't think Navy's going to be able to slow down Byron Brown. So I'll take USF to win that one by at least 10, continue to assert themselves as the best group of 5 team, definitely the best team in the American right now. Arizona Cincinnati over 56.5. This is a really fun one, and I think a lot of people are overlooking this Arizona team. They're 6-3, guys. I think a lot of people would assume that they were 4-5, that they were 3-6, because last year was rough for Brent Brennan and company, but Noah Fafita is putting together a very, very nice season. Their pass defense has been absolutely incredible with guys like Javion Cole back there. They are a very, very fun team to watch. I think Cincinnati is just a very potent offense. Now, with the Arizona back end being as good as it is, a guy to watch is Cyrus Allen. Been huge for Cincinnati this entire year. They've been able to really take the top off of defenses. Can Arizona slow that down? Now, the other problem is you got Tawee Walker back there for Cincinnati as well. I think they're going to be able to score regardless of what this thing looks like for Arizona from a defensive perspective. And then I think Noah Fafita is just playing at a very high level. And you look at the Cincinnati pass defense, it struggles quite a bit in some big-time moments. I think there's going to be a moment where Arizona is able to at least make some big-time plays, at least get the ball over the top for some big plays down the field. I think this is a fun shootout. I think we could be looking at like a 21-17 game going into half, understanding that Cincinnati's got to get this one done before they go on the road and play a very, very tough game against BYU. I'll take Georgia Tech minus 16.5 over Boston College this week. Georgia Tech coming off a bye always makes me feel good because that means Haynes King at the very least is, let's call it 85%. I feel like he's never close to 100% just the way that he plays, but at the very least, they're going to feel confident running him in this game, and they probably will have a lot of success doing it. Boston College is the 111th in run defense in the entire country. You're not facing C.J. Bailey, which makes that a whole lot easier. You're also getting back guys like Amari Harvey, Xavion Riley. It's going to be huge to get all those guys back. Jai Gilmore, another guy in that back end that missed time, and it was very noticeable in that NC State game. I think they're going to be able to do a lot of really good in this game. The other part of that is I think the committee has proven they're not, I don't want to say not taking Georgia Tech seriously, but I think Georgia Tech's going to have to earn a little bit more than some of these other teams are. We can argue about why that is. We can argue if it's warranted or not. But regardless, I think Georgia Tech has to put on a show in this one. I think they have to prove that they are not only a team that can go win games, and this might be kind of going against Brent Key's philosophy, but I think you got to lay it on this team. I think you got to go up by 30 and then try to score one more time, and then send Aaron Philo out there and say, let's go throw the football around. I really do think Georgia Tech has to go down the stretch where the committee members look at that score, because they're probably not watching the game, but that's beside the point. They look at that score at the end of the Saturday and say, man, Georgia Tech really put it on Boston College. I get it. It's Boston College, but they put up a fight against Notre Dame a couple of weeks ago. So I think Georgia Tech gets this one done. I think they put on a show and send at least a little bit of a message to the CFP committee. I'll take Iowa USC under 48.5. It's a rain play. It's going to be rainy as can be over there in LA, and it's going to be rainy before the game, so it's going to be muddy out there. It's going to be really, really gross in the Rose Bowl this time around. And that just means Kirk Ferentz is going to be playing his football game. And the biggest thing here is not to say USC can't play this game, this style of game. They can't play with Iowa. And the funny thing is, I picked Iowa yesterday. I picked this game to go over. I picked 27-24. Then I rethought that. I don't think there's going to be quite enough offense in this thing. I think I got a little ahead of myself when I was talking about this Iowa offense. But the reality is this game's going to be shortened. I think both these teams at most get about 10 possessions probably in this football game, and you got to make the most of them. King Miller on one side, Kamari Moulton on the other. I think it's going to be a run-heavy game. I just think it's going to be ugly. I think you could be getting to halftime and it's 6-3, and no one's getting anything going. Guys are barely making kicks, and they're able to open it up a little bit in the second half, able to get a little bit more comfortable, but I just don't think any offense is going to be clean in this football game. I'll take the under 48.5, and I feel pretty good about that one. I'll take Alabama, -5.5 over Oklahoma. I feel too good about this one. I think bettors know what I'm talking about when I say that. Whenever you feel really good about a bet, you start to think about betting the other side. But Oklahoma's a great team, and I think they've done a lot of really great stuff. I think they have a real shot in this football game. I keep coming back to one thing, and that's the Texas football game, and especially the Texas offensive approach. Texas couldn't run the ball, much like Alabama couldn't. Coming into that game, they had no run game to speak of. The offensive line was one of the worst in the SEC, one of the worst in the country, playing at that very moment. What they did is they didn't run the ball all that often. Now, Trey Wisner was a huge player in that game, broke off a couple of big ones that were massive, but it was the short passing game that made a difference for that team. The way that I see it, you have a better version of Arch Manning and Ty Simpson that can get the ball out quickly and accurately. You have better weapons on the outside to make plays after the catch, like Ryan Williams, Jeremy Bernard, Isaiah Horton, all of those guys. And a guy like Josh Cuevas, I think, is huge in this football game. Nothing to take away from Jack Andrews. Was a great player, was a good player in that Oklahoma game. But I think Josh Cuevas brings a different animal to this Oklahoma defense. I think they're going to have to deal with a lot more than they had to deal with in that Texas game, and I think the Alabama offense is going to execute at a higher level. So I think Mateer will play better. There's no doubt about that. I think Mateer will give them more. Obviously, he is more healthy. I think he's going to play better football in this game. I think Yonze Pierre is an absolute nightmare, and I think he's going to do enough to keep that guy in the pocket, kind of take away his legs, which is a massive piece of this run game. I think Alabama does enough defensively and kind of just schemes their way to a win here. I think Kalen DeBoer is going to watch that Texas game and say, yeah, we can do that. And they're probably going to execute at a very high level and be able to get out with at least a touchdown win here. NC State, Miami over 55.5. This is a really fun game for a number of reasons, but mainly because could CJ Bailey just kind of take over the country? He gets the big-time win over Georgia Tech, kind of hobbled for the second half of that game, with just ripping balls all over the yard. Now you got a big-time shot to knock Miami out of the CFP and become kind of the big name. Now, NC State would have to contend with some people in the offseason. I think we all understand that. But at the end of the day, is a really, really tough player to play against. I think he's going to make enough plays. Now, this Miami defense has come a very long way. And obviously, with Akeem Mesidor and Ruben Bain and Keontae Scott being an elite player on the back end for this football team, they've played really, really well. I think CJ Bailey's just too tough of an athlete to bottle up all afternoon. I think he's going to be able to make enough plays with his legs. I think that wide receiver core is coming along very nicely with Takari Collins and Noah Rogers, and I believe Justin Jolie will be back for this game. I could be wrong, but I think he's going to be in the mix. It's going to be a team that I think is more dangerous than some people have respect for. The other side of that is the NC State pass defense is the worst in the ACC. I think Carson Beck has an afternoon. I think Malachi Toney has a great day, CJ Daniels, all of those guys. do basically whatever they want. I mean, we saw Haynes King throw for 400 yards against this team. Not something Haynes King normally does. And a lot of that was circumstantial, but doesn't mean it wasn't super easy for Haynes King to be able to do that. I think Carson Beck has a huge afternoon. I think CJ Bailey adds on a number of highlight plays himself, and I think they at least get to 56 points in this one. Missouri Mississippi State over 51.5, quite a few overs today, but at the end of the day, I'm very excited about this one, and that guy on the screen, number 3, is actually now with the Tigers, so that's an interesting conversation, an interesting kind of subplot as we head into this one, but Mississippi State struggled last week kind of for the first time this season, at least in a grandstand. They lost relatively big to A&M earlier in the year, but we're firmly in that game, deep into that game, so this is one of those where you just got to be able to execute quick hitters. It is kind of the same thing we just talked about with Alabama. The Missouri pass rush will take over this game if you let them. Zion Young is an absolute nightmare. Damon Wilson is not much easier to deal with. You're going to have to hit those quick slants to guys like Anthony Evans, guys like Brennan Thompson, Seydou Traore are going to be massive in this game. And I think Blake Shapen has enough. Now, could Kamario Taylor be a bigger part of this conversation because maybe his legs make that a little bit tougher on those edge defenders? That's something to watch as well. I just think they're going to come out offensively with more fire, with a better plan and execute at a higher level because I think very highly of Jeff Lebby in that offense. And then on the other side with Zollers, even with Zollers, I think they're going to be able to run the football very, very aggressively in this football game. We saw what Arizona State did earlier in the year. Now, it's been quite a bit of time. Mississippi State's playing better football against the run, but we also saw what Georgia and Nate Frazier was able to do last week. So I think Missouri has a day on the ground. I think they're able to score at least 27 or so points in this game. I'm going to pick Mississippi State to win it, but I think we got a shootout coming in Columbia, and I think it's going to be a really fun one. Maybe a little bit of a Matt Zollers coming out party. And then TCU plus 3.5 versus BYU. BYU comes off a very tough loss to Texas Tech. They go into a TCU team that is kind of just playing with house money the rest of the way. They're very frustrated with how the season has gone thus far, but still a very talented team. And if you allow Josh Hoover to get comfortable, it's going to be a long day for you. I can promise you that. So it's going to be really interesting to see what this TCU team has. Sonny Dykes has never had teams that kind of fold late in seasons. They always fight to the very end, and I tend to believe that's going to be the case for this one. The run defense is relatively strong for TCU. Not elite, but I think they're going to be able to do enough against, I'll say a gimpy LJ Martin, probably not 100%, probably relatively close. He's had a couple of weeks to come back from that injury, but didn't look the same against Texas Tech for a number of reasons, a lot of them doing with Texas Tech. But at the end of the day, TCU's run defense is strong enough to at least get this thing off to a slow start. And BYU's kind of searching for offense late in this one. I think TCU might just win this game. I think they might just salvage their season a little bit and get a big-time win over BYU. And then you got BYU Cincinnati walking in thinking, we got to stay alive for the Big 12 championship. We lose another one, maybe Utah could back their way into this thing if Cincinnati loses to Arizona. So a lot still on the table over there in the Big 12. But at the end of the day, I'm going to pick TCU to at least cover the 3.5. I might even pick them to win, but if you'll give me the field goal and a hook, I'll take that as well. So we'll do TCU plus 3.5 there, and hopefully we can get back over 500 and get rolling as we get close to the end of the season, because we'd love to be over 500 heading into those playoff games that are going to be very, very hard to pick. But as we wrap this thing up, we got a special weekend ahead. I think it is a domino weekend, and I think the funny thing about dominoes, they can fall either direction. There is a chaos direction. There is a not as chaotic direction. I won't necessarily say not chaotic because it's college football, but at the end of the day, I do think you have a world where USC, Texas, Oklahoma, and Pitt all win this weekend. Now, that would clear up some things with Notre Dame, but let's just say all that happens. I don't know what the SEC looks like. The Big Ten is firmly alive for 4 teams to get into that thing, and the SEC is alive to have 7, 10, and 2 teams. I don't know what that would look like, and the ACC is still alive to get 2 teams into that thing. If Iowa, Georgia, Bama, Notre Dame win, we'll have more answers. Texas and Oklahoma will be likely out of the mix. Maybe Texas at 9-3 could get back in, but that's all very hypothetical at this very moment. Overall, it's going to be a special one. We'll be back here on Monday to break it all down. We'll get into what it means for the CFP, if it's gotten more or less murky. I tend to believe it's going to get more because that's just the way the weeks have gone thus far this season. But we'll enjoy it all. Please do enjoy it as well. We'll see you guys back here on Monday. Please do like, subscribe, comment means the absolute world to me. Want to build something special around here, and you guys liking means the world to me and definitely does help that out. So please do that. Please comment any questions you have, any grievances you have. I'm more than happy to talk it out and all of that different stuff. But please do all that stuff, and thank you so much for tuning in. See you guys on Monday to break down what I have to assume is going to be a crazy college football slate.